Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so I mean, there's product management's kind of always been around, right? Has it been the product management that people kind of know and love today is probably up for debate as to what we were doing in 2005 versus kind of how much better it's gotten since then, right? And how it's now like a real recognized role. I think American Express, it was like a cross between business development, sales, right, and ops. And kind of when you put all of those things together, you get products. So there was a small group of us that went into another organization in Amex, kind of separated off and introduced Amex to Agile, got into the whole Scrum teams. We went to full on like scaled Agile from that, and then slowly grew until we were a product management organization at American Express. So yeah, 2005 was a while ago, but now that's the term that everyone knows, and there's obviously organizations that are just all about supporting product management. It's nice to kind of have it be official. So now my title is officially Global Product Head for Financial Crimes at Ernst & Young. I've been in role here about 3 years, growing from a product to a platform, and then kind of talking about, well, now that we have a platform, like what do we do next, right? Kind of how do you expand to maybe other areas that aren't necessarily financial crimes, but can be covered by your product. So I will go through and talk about what I feel, right, on my journey has been most important to growing your product. I think in order to want to grow your product, you kind of have to understand your product, right? Have your team know, have you guys really believe in what you're building? And then from the product, in order to grow that, you really have to have your team, right, that I just stressed. And how do you grow your team? How do you identify who is the right people for your team? How do you identify what strengths, right? What personalities, kind of what makes good team? And then how do you grow that team? In order to really grow that team, what you also have to do is grow yourself, right? And I'll talk about what I did, where I started, how far and not far I've come in terms of what I'm doing now versus where I started at American Express. Answering the phone, being a customer service rep, working in operations for foreign exchange at Amex, to now managing what is a financial crimes platform at Ernst & Young. And in reality, it's not that far off from the two in the financial services world. But what have I done differently? How have I pushed myself? Something that you'll hear me say, and there's a book out there about this. It's like, what got you here won't get you there. So it's what was I doing up front? What was I doing initially? What's the difference between using a product, answering the phones, and then how do I grow into who I am today, which is kind of the head of an entire financial services platform at UI. I will encourage questions along the way, right? I think I'm more happy to make this like a more comfortable back and forth flow. I know there's always time for questions set at the end, but if you guys do have anything, you can type them in. I should be able to see them. I've got the queue up right now. So if there is anything, it should pop up on my screen. And I think Brian and I can identify them through other means as well. So if you have something, feel free to stop me. Otherwise, we can just start talking about kind of product, right? I can talk about my roadmap. I'll talk about what a roadmap is to me. I know there's going to be different levels of product managers here. Some are probably fresh, some are tenured. You're all, the word product is so vague, right? It's going to be hard to talk specifically to you, but we can talk about the generalization of product and what you can do to grow yours, and what, from I say is what changes from today. So you've got your product, right? You got whatever you're working on. I'll talk about my financial crimes platform and what we started with, which was one small aspect, which was a know your KYC, right? A know your client or a know your customer product, which we offered. We had a plan for that product, right? Similar to, I'm sure, what most of you guys are talking about. You work in sprints. You've probably got a PI where you bring your teams together every so often and really talk about kind of what's the next quarter going to look like, for what are the next 5 or 6 sprints going to look like. If you're lucky, you'd plan out your budget for a full year. I don't know how many of these real agile organizations are getting that luxury, I would say, of having a full year of budget in front of them. Some people probably see things sprintly, some people probably see things monthly. It just depends on the type of organization that you're in. But you should have your plan, right? Something that you're 80 to 90% confident that you can do across the next 2 weeks, you can do across the next month, and you can do across the next quarter. I knew what my plan was. We knew our budget, we knew our head count, right? And I've got a pretty good feeling every Wednesday morning where I'm going to end up kind of, 14 days from there, 10 business days from there, what we're going to get done, what I'm going to be tested, what I'm going to ship, right, and what's going to be available for the client. That's my plan. When you want to talk about the future of your product and you want to talk about growing your product, you want to have your goals. And I think, you talk about goals, which is potentially a 2-year plan, potentially a 3-year plan. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything set in stone, right? I mean, you'll find out that I'm sure everyone here sees their plans change in a sprint, see it change from day to day, right? So kind of there's not a hard and fast plan for a 2-year plan. There's not a good 3-year plan, but you want to have your elevator pitch. You want to know what your product can grow into. What should I be looking for next? Because as that product manager, right, as the owner of it, you want to be able to talk up. You want to be able to talk out, right, while solving those problems for your team at the same time, but focusing on growing that product. Goes into the kind of my next bullet point is there's 0 to 1, right? If there's anyone here that's started with nothing, started with a team, or you've come on board to build something out, right? You've been there from kind of that ideation phase, then to a launch. You've probably had most of that road mapped out. You've probably had a pretty good idea of what your MVP, your minimum viable product, or like a minimum saleable product is for you or for your team to get to. So it's pretty easy to get from that 0 to 1. Then you talk about going from 1 to 100, right? So can I get from launch and then can I get to growth? And the differences that really come from growth is something that can be planned for. You can think about it, but you're not really going to set those plans in a hard and fast motion for your next year, right? You should have ideas of how you can grow your product. We knew that on the KYC side, we had a strong workflow, right? We had a good tool. We had something that we could offer to our clients. Then what was the basis of that tool, right? How else can we apply our tool to either other areas of financial services? How can I take the parts of my tool that are really that configurable and turn it into a larger platform that could maybe service other types of organizations that are not just financial services? Or maybe you want to take it much deeper into the fin crime and start offering things around anti-money laundering, transaction monitoring services, right? Investigative services, not just that KYC. So on your plan, right, you've probably got how do I get to 1, but you really need to be thinking about how do I get to that 100 after that? What's next for us, right? What's down the road? And that's kind of that difference between your roadmap and your vision. I've got notes on the side here, which you guys can read, but this is a note from DJ Patil. He was the lead data scientist at the White House a couple of years ago. This stays on my desktop as just something to keep in the back of my mind because I think it's short, it's quick, it's easy, and it's very pertinent to the product manager life. It's nice to talk about, and you'll kind of see some of these points tie to what I'm talking about on the left-hand side. As you go from 0 to 1, right, and as you start to go from 1 to 100, if your product is successful and you start to grow and you start to realize that there's maybe more vendors you want to reach out to, there's more partnerships, there's potentially some changes in your architecture that you'd like to make. Maybe you started with one type of service and you're moving to a different one, right? You'll start to grow your stakeholders from that product. You as the product manager, if you're the face of the product, if you're kind of coordinating with everyone, you need to know your product and you need to know your stakeholders. You need to understand who you're reporting to. You need to understand who is responsible to get you that information. You'll have to talk to initially you might have 1 or 2 people, and as you grow to from a service line wide product to a market wide product to like a global product, you'll find your stakeholders grow in numbers, right? They'll exponentially grow to different types of people that might not be familiar with their product. They might not know much about financial crimes, right? They might not know much about exactly who you are or what you're trying to do. You'll have to figure out, how am I now molding my product? How am I molding my message, right? How am I going to shape my team and my ask to now, have that broader reach to these different types of people that are going to help me out, right? There's a ton of different, I could get a demo a week. I could get a demo a day probably from vendors across the board, right? Right now it's probably the AI space, right? In the ML space for us. I could probably get a demo a day from a different vendor with different people that are interested in doing work with us or we're interested in doing work with, right? Expanding on from what has just been your standard development team. It's just maybe been your engineers and your PO, and you've got one business leader that you work with that's out there pushing your product or maybe feeding you those business requirements or working, with you to make sure that what you're building is what they want. Now you've got 2 to 3 to like 10 other, sides of the business that are asking you for details, that are asking you to pivot, that are asking you to, oh, can we do X, A, B, or C instead of X, Y, and Z, which was your plan. Now you talk about, well, we're starting to grow. We've got our roadmap, right? I've got a vision of where I want it to be, and you've got to figure out how to manage kind of all of that input, because that's going to shape, how your product actually grows. That 1 to 100 is just, it involves so much, it involves exponentially more than your 0 to 1. In order to get that done, right, we'll talk about kind of your team and your team's team. And this more goes to kind of my second topic that we'll get into about like how do you grow your team and how do you feel comfortable with your team. But you're going to start to get further away, right? There's going to be layers of people between you and your engineers. There's going to be layers of people between you and your QA. There's going to be layers the other way, right? If you're getting larger and now there's more owners of the business that are between you and kind of who you used to work with, because you're getting wider. So now there's more responsibility or more service lines. Like we're generally with financial services, but we're starting to talk to tax, assurance, consulting, right? There's just groups out there that are going to either grow outside or down. So as you start to grow your leadership team, you'll find out you're putting distance between yourself and who you used to kind of be in the weeds with. And I think that was particularly tough for me. I'll go on like a slight, history for myself. Like I used to be customer service. I used to be operations. So back in the day, I would answer the calls, we would run through the tickets, right? Like I would have intimate knowledge of exactly how bad our system was because I was on the end of the phone calls, right? Clients were calling me complaining about X, Y, and Z. Transactions weren't going through, clients weren't loading, beneficiaries weren't posting, right? It was a host of problems that I felt good that I could solve. And then as you start to grow your product, and as you start to grow away from that, you'll realize like you can't do that anymore. There's those layers between you and those issues where you have to have comfort knowing that your leaders can do that work, trusting other people inside of there. So when you add those layers of ownership, right, that's going to change from how you were used to being a single point of contact for X, Y, and Z. Inside those layers of ownership, you're also talking about the actual just straight content that's around your product, right? Like as your technical decks grow, as your wikis grow on your product, as all your technical documentation grows, like it's going to be too much for one person to really know, write, update, push, and just full on own. So that growth and just the sheer amount of information grows. As that grows, there's obviously gaps that grow, right? And as your teams grow, there's going to be gaps in between those teams. And if you're lucky enough, you'll have that coverage across the board. But how do you grow your growth? How do you minimize the gaps? How do you not worry that there's just one person that if that person, I'm sure everyone has this, and I'm sure you're all thinking of someone like in your organization now, like there's always one person that if that person walks, you've lost something somewhere, right? And it gets worse and there's kind of larger issues and larger risks as your product grows. And I bet there's some that you won't even know about until someone leaves, someone finds a new job, right? Someone quits, then there's this worry that you did not know about, right? So how are you going to plan for that? What should you be working towards to ensure that you're growing that knowledge amongst your team, and you're also minimizing that gap that could potentially happen somewhere? Having your strong team in there is like paramount to making sure that when things do go wrong, they're easily recoverable, right? Or they don't go as wrong as they could, I should say. And then the last thing we talk about is pivoting, maturing, right? There's all sorts of products you'll hear about that started off doing A, and now they've either found a new home, they found a different use for the technology, right? They've matured to a much larger kind of scope out there, and it's worked for them. I think a lot of products that choose to do one thing can do one thing very, very well. And there's a lot where you have to make a call of, well, how do I continually grow, right? Like, I mean, Dan Schulman at PayPal, right, an example right now, like they weren't always just doing P2P payments. They're now an entire ecosphere. They have entire markets, right? What they offer is just gone beyond simply sharing payments via your email address. Figuring out from your product, like, what is the potential of it? Where do I want to be? Where should we end up? And how do I not, how do I grow in an appropriate manner so we don't lose that? So these are all things to think about when you're growing, your product. What I touched on earlier, what I go into now is, in order to grow your product, right, you have to have a strong team. You can't just continually do everything yourself. There's absolutely no way that you would be able to, manage, if you're managing a project now and you're managing your product now and you want to grow at 10x, you can't expect to be doing that all yourself and be just as successful. How do you identify your leaders, and then how do you invest in them? I will say that as I've gotten, away from the person answering the angry phone calls, right, and realizing that I'm not going to be the one that's closing out tickets and closing bugs and defects, I've gotten more satisfaction myself out of seeing my team be successful, right? Seeing my team grow. So things that I look for in my product leadership are kind of these three skills right here. I want to see strong relationship management. I think there's certain ways that certain people like to be communicated with. And I think it's very important that everyone understands what that is. I want my leaders to know who likes emails, who likes calls, who likes Teams, who likes, God forbid, like FaceTime or something when you're not prepared for it. How do you actually manage that? How do you keep abreast of all the changes that are going on? How do you know who you should be talking to, and how do you do it in a manner which best represents me and my product, right? I want to talk about them having ownership. So the leaders that I employ and leaders that work for me underneath Financial Crimes Platform, I want them to not be leaders in a need for escalation. Like if something goes wrong, things should be escalated to them. I don't want things to be escalated to them because people don't know what to do. I want them to feel like they are true owners of their silo. My chief architect, right? He owns architecture for us. Decisions that go through architecture don't have to be escalated to him because his technical architect or his engineering lead doesn't know it, but he is responsible for that platform. Like having him own it, having my engineering lead really own engineering and not just be a person that someone comes to bounce questions off of, or hey, should I do A or should I do B? It's very important for that person to feel like, one, they are responsible for it, and two, that they want to take that responsibility, right? Something I'll touch on later is when you send out meetings or we have different agendas, I like to really just have my one leader on there and that leader be responsible. I don't like to, it's tough to avoid it, right? But everyone, you send out a meeting invite to someone and maybe they forward it on and now you've got the whole engineering team, right? After a few days, everyone just shows up and now it's this massive call, right? When you really want one person to be that owner, I want it to flow through them and I want them to be responsible. Then I talk about inspiration, right? They should be bringing ideas to me. They're in that role for a reason. I am not a solution architect at heart, right? I know enough to be dangerous, like everyone says. I want them to come with their ideas. And I think as long as you're instilling that ownership in them, they should feel comfortable bringing it to you, right? I put full trust in the people that are on my team, put full trust in the decisions that they make, and I will, back them up. As long as they have the data to prove it and we talk through it, there's always discussion. But once they've come to their decision, I'm on board with them, right? That's why they're part of my leadership team. And I think it's just as important for them to, have that inspirational, show that they know what they're doing, really enjoy it, have that ownership, feel comfortable doing it. All of that kind of makes strong product leadership to me. So, you've got yourself, you've got your product. In order to build out this product, how am I going to get there, right? How am I going to get from 1 to 100? Something I think is important is finding kind of it's your you, right? Who's going to be that next person if you want to grow in the role, if you want to promote yourself up higher, if you want to turn your product into a platform, you'll need to find someone that's you, that you can, mold, you can work with, that you can trust, that's going to really help you step back. I mentioned that, I was answering the phones, I was doing the ops, and then slowly I started to design a better system for us. We were using Salesforce at the time, right? And we didn't have an online application, so we had put one together, and I stepped back from handling those applications and those phone calls to actually building the application. But I had people on my team that I trusted that could be in place to still answer the calls, to still work with the clients, right? To still satisfy that role and that gap that I was leaving. And so when I back out and I kind of take a step away from how close I was, I now need to do those bottom two things. I need to define new goals. What is success for me? Because it's no longer a certain number of phone calls per minute. It's no longer average handling time on a per case, right? There's different success for me. Then it's making sure that those goals that are no longer under me, how can I delegate that work out? I think there's a lot of this if not me, then who, which I see around our organization a lot, where you just kind of pick up work because you don't think anyone else is doing it. You can't continue to do that if you want to grow you and your leaders. I think you should clearly delegate your work down, make sure that you are working up, and then having comfort in that responsibility that there are others that are essentially doing that for you. That's your view, right? So once you've got yourself set, you can talk about kind of how do I equip my leaders? Like what makes them successful? I don't know the other organizations, people that are working with that they're at right now, right? But Ernst & Young, we talk about on the product side, we are on client technology. So I build products. Success for me is defined very different from people on the consulting side that are selling people and hours. How do I make my team successful? Part of that is just establishing kind of what are your goals, right? What should we plan on for you for your future so your team knows exactly what they are responsible for? Then you have that clear line of ownership. When I talk about, how important I think that is for people to be able to go to someone to know that they can get the answer, right? And that it's the right answer. I think it's important to let your team and your leadership team know that they are that responsible person, right? Like if it goes both ways. They're in charge of making those decisions. They should feel good about making those decisions, and I'll back them up for those decisions. But they need to know that that's about them, right? That's their responsibility. And the success that comes out of that, what is success for them, right? What do I mean when I want to talk about turning over, working through the PI? Like, what's a successful PI for my program manager? I want these documentations. I want these artifacts. I want these teams signed off. Like being very clear with them that this is your baby. Like you should own this. You should feel comfortable owning it. This is exactly what I'm expecting of you so that we're on the same page. I think there's, I run into this, there's like a gray area where kind of, I guess, what do they say? Product management, right? You're responsible for everything, in charge of nothing, right? There's no one really that sits underneath me, but I am responsible for them. When you talk about that, you want to eliminate that gray area, right? I want my solution architect to know what he's in charge of. I want my engineering lead to know what he's in charge of. And I want them to know that there's overlap, and that's what we're all here for. And that's how we kind of are that product leadership team. But this is where it comes down to, this is your role. This is, clear as mud in some cases, but this is what I kind of need you for. And then how do you push your leaders, right? So you've got you kind of who your protege is. You've got them comfortable. You've now identified your leaders. They're in their roles, right? They're ready to go. And then how do you push them? I think there's certain things that people generally like to do. I think you'll find your engineering leads like to get the weeds. Your solution architects like to draw nice diagrams, right? And they push all this stuff out. And then how do you get them out of that comfort zone to grow their skill set? I think there's a host of, depending on your organization, there's a host of, I know some people that would rather die than have to talk on camera, right? To like a group of people. They would rather just go and do their work. How do you push your leaders to really get out there and grow their own skill sets? Because if they're high enough up that they're on your leadership team, chances are they're very good kind of at their role. But if you want to push them outwards, right? If you want to grow them to being more capable, like I feel comfortable with everyone on my team that they can fully discuss the product, that they're fully confident in where I want to be in 2 years. We are all on the same page, and that they can go and talk to other leaders that aren't necessarily in my group. I've got one of my architects that sits over in Poland. Like I have very little to do with the Poland area, but he is essentially like a people leader over in Poland because we've pushed him up to essentially grow into that role, right? Seeing where people can get out and expand and not necessarily just stay in that one vertical rounds out your leadership team. And it works well with the relationship management aspect that I have in here. And it works well for the inspiration aspect, right? People, if they're more comfortable working outside their zone, when things go bad, they might not be as hectic, right? Or they might not feel as bad, or they might not be thrown for a loop as much because they're comfortable doing these things. And I see a question pop up here from Matt Moschel, and I'll jump into this real quick. But actually, you know what, Matt, maybe we'll go to the next one, and this will potentially answer your question. So the question says, what advice do you have when it comes to working on a team that's spread out over multiple time zones? How do you stay connected? So we've established what you want to do with your product. We established that you want to grow it, right? That it's going to be some changes from how you're currently working today. We've established your leadership team, right? You've got you've got your leaders, you're pushing your leaders. I'm going to talk you through kind of what I do. How do I enable myself to grow beyond my current skill set? And I think maybe even definitely pre-COVID, right, in a global scale, working on global products, we have different people in different time zones. There's how do you have that feeling of connectedness? So I'm just putting out here examples of kind of how I worked, how I've set myself up, and how I've kind of set my, I'll say, my cadence for how work happens. So when we say, how do you stay connected? I offer different, I'll say there's different levels of connection that happen on a set cadence. So I've got my daily work, right? I always have my Teams channel. I'm never green, right? I'm always red on Teams. I'm always in meetings, but it's always there, right? There's always the ability for someone to reach out. I don't ever want to not make time for the team, right? I'm going to make sure I'm connecting the team. I don't have anything, I have no daily mandatory calls because I think everyone and their mother has enough meetings like all day long. I don't need more meetings. I don't need anything that's that daily, but the option is there. We'll save time. We'll work on it. Our team knows that they can always ping one another with any problems throughout the day. Will we get back immediately? Probably not, right? But the channel is there. The ability to reach me on Teams, the ability to shoot an email, or the ability to call me, like that's up to whoever I'm working with. One way of just keeping that open channel is fine. Next step up, I talk about like weekly and sprintly cadences. So what are we doing weekly? I have weekly meetings with all sorts of groups. Or we have my engineering group, I have my leadership team. But one thing that I would be absolutely shocked if everyone on this call said that every one of your meetings had an agenda, right? I think I can safely say that's not true for anyone, right? I think all of your meetings just say, here's the topic, and it's either your name and another person's name, right? And that's it. Cory, Jared, one-to-one. That's it, right? There's not really anything in there. I'd like to stress that the meetings have these agendas. Then it lets you prioritize items, lets you talk from the top to the bottom. It doesn't let you waste 25 minutes on the first item, and then you realize that you have 5 minutes left now for the other 14 items that you guys should have been talking about, but because you didn't have an agenda, you didn't know about. How do you make sure that you're using that time wisely? I have one-to-ones weekly with everyone on my leadership team, and some people are at skip levels right down there. I personally don't use one-to-ones to cover things that are day-to-day issues, things that I can get from somewhere else in decks or project meetings or updates, right? One-to-ones to me are somewhat more personal with the team, and that's kind of how I try to stay connected. Is I use that time to really, how are you doing, right? Like, what is going on in your life? What are you doing this weekend? What did you do the past week? I mean, if people don't want to share, that's fine. I don't push for it. Everyone's always happy to get time back, but I try not to make it all about our work. Like, I always start off with something that's not work related, and I would love to talk about something that's not work related because the other 9.5 hours of my day are work related meetings, right? So it's nice to take a break in there. I try to do that to stay connected. When we talk about the weekly meetings, I touched on this before, right? But like, I like to keep those attendee lists small. I like to try to have them to people that are responsible for making decisions. People in this call, like, you shouldn't have to go to someone else. And if you have to go to someone else, then I've either invited the wrong person or we're talking about the wrong thing, right? So like, that's how I kind of drive action out of these meetings. You don't want to have a meeting, a whole bunch of takeaways, or ask people to go and talk to other people about it. If you've got your leads, if they're comfortable and they own it, by all means, like, you should walk out of meetings with action being taken. Two things that I want to think about is like, how much of your week is meetings, and then how much of your engineers' week is meetings. If your engineers are putting in 80 hours a week, right, and you're cutting out breaks and you're cutting out lunch, what's the percentage of time that you would assume they're actually doing hands-on keyboard development? Is it 50 hours, 60 hours, 70 hours, right? 40 hours? Like, how many hours a day are you scheduling meetings with them? How many hours a day is your leadership scheduling meetings with them? And kind of are they all necessary? Because it's really the point of all of these meetings, just to talk, and everyone's got their daily stand-ups already. That's 15 minutes knocked out. You've got an hour for lunch, right? There's always bathrooms. There's just walking breaks, right? Mental health breaks. Like, if you take all those hours out of a day, how many more hours are you really willing to take out of them just for other meetings to get sign off or to talk to people, or maybe you're not sure, so you want some sort of vote by committee? Like, it shouldn't be that way. So I try to weekly have meetings with the minimum amount of attendees possible, have action in every one of those, have an agenda in every one of those meetings, have an action out of that meeting, and then move on to the next one. On a monthly cadence, right, we should always be working I should have my leadership team thinking about who else should we be talking to, right? If your guys are at large organizations, I think EY is 300,000 people, right? I'm sure there's people out there that I haven't met that I don't even know exist that could be helping our product. I'm sure there's people out there who I could be helping from our product, right? Making those connections, forcing people to go look around, attending different webinars. Like I'll always make time. I'll always make budget for personal growth. I don't think there's any reason, I don't think I've ever turned down a request for someone to go and do X, Y, or Z. People that want to, I want people on my leadership team to get those certifications, right? I want them to go to external seminars. I want them to budget accordingly their own time. I don't want anyone, feel like they have to go on a three-day certification somewhere and then work for over the weekend for that. Like all of this is baked into me, into how I want my leadership team to be. Leading by example, I want to be going out and going to those seminars, right? I want to be giving talks when I can. I want to be seeing how we can get out there and make these connections with others that aren't just at EY, right? There's a ton of different vendors out there that we work with. There's a ton of different financial services groups, banks that can all, that I should be talking to that I'm not talking to because I'm in meetings every day, kind of working through budget things or working through HR and talent issues, right? Trying to hire new people, that all of those things get the product done. Setting aside time monthly to really, upskill yourself and get the product out there, I think is just as important. I think quarterly, right? You should be talking about your plan. You should be talking about your roadmap and where do you want to be? Is it the same thing that you talked about 3 months ago? Chances are it's not, right? You've probably pivoted across those last 5 or 6 sprints. You've probably done 1 or 2 different things. Maybe a client's popped up with a different ask, or there's been a vendor that's come out with something that you guys want to partner with, right? So I think that quarterly, working across, getting alignment from people globally. There's always, I think my meetings are generally 6 a.m.s on Thursdays, right? It's always brutal for one time zone. There's always someone in Australia that's up at 3 a.m. or Hong Kong that's not really happy with the time of the call that we have. But, quarterly, it's really not that bad of an ask to do that. I put offsites in here. I won't get into the whole return to office that's going on right now. I think if its ability to meet face to face, if you are on a global team, you hack out much more and you learn much more about your team just sitting in a room for hours, going out to dinner and drinks after, hanging out, doing some sort of event together. I think it's very, very important to build that relationship. I think if I go back to the previous slide and talk about finding your you, it's very hard to find your you across the computer, right? So I think it's very important to talk through how do you keep that connection, right? I've worked with people that I have never met, right, in person. And then I've worked with people where my relationship has grown much, much stronger after we've met in person, after we've sat in the same terrible conference room, right, for 3 days at a time in London. I think it's very important. And then what I want to end on for all of this is everything that we've talked about, the daily, weekly, sprintly, quarterly, you will have plans that will come out of that. I think the saying goes, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So all of your plans will never, I don't think a single plan has worked, right? To a T. There's always been some sort of pivot. Something's always gone wrong. But if you keep up this cadence, if you keep up the connection, if you have the strong leadership team, if you guys work together and you stay close, that planning is what's going to allow you to pivot. That planning is what's going to make no surprises in your quarterly meeting, right? It's what's going to make your weekly meetings go that much easier because you guys are on top of each other. There's constant communication. You're talking through X, Y, and Z. I think it's really a strong way to kind of keep myself in order, to keep my leadership team, on the same page, and to make sure that we're always understanding our product. As long as I understand my product, I'm setting the vision, I'm setting the roadmap, I'm comfortable that my leaders do it. I have trust that my leaders are also having their team do it, right? So it kind of funnels down. And I think that's where it's most important to me. It's just that trust in your leadership team, trust in yourself, and then your product will grow from there if you've got it set. So I've got some slide up here for Q&A. Brian, I think that's kind of good on time.
Yeah, we're definitely good on time. I think we have at least a healthy 10 minutes of Q&A. So folks, if you have questions, please get them in. But Cory, I'll say for my part, really appreciate everything you just went through. I think that strongly resonated with a lot of my experience and frankly made me look at some of the things I've been doing and say, gosh, I got to start, taking some of these best practices and more strongly applying them. So I really appreciate all that.
Thanks, Ryan.
I am curious, and this is purely just a curiosity question. You mentioned early on kind of your proto PM experience as you all started more in the operational side of things. Do you feel like you had a PM mentality then, whatever that means to you? Or was that something that you kind of retrospectively grew into?
So I like to, and there's two things. One, being on the ops side is very process oriented, right? So there's a lot to go through it step by step by step. You've got your documentation in front of you. You understand what you have to do. Clients calling their issues. Like, it's very detailed in knowing how the machine works, the software that you're working with, the clients that you're calling, and like fully understanding every aspect of it. Because a lot of clients calling in live, right? So there's really issues that you need to handle now. And I used to say that I hate talking to clients, because if a client called up, like, they were unhappy, right? No one called up because they like to say, hey, like, we love your product, right? There was never a phone call that was good news. Getting into that, really understanding what clients were calling in about, understanding kind of the end user of that product. It was a mix of our clients, and it was a mix of myself. Gave me a healthy view of, I now get, like, when I'm building a product, like, what to really keep in mind here. So when I talk about KYC and I talk about, working on compliance related items, like, I've been in the room with the regulator, I've been the ops guy doing the work, and I've been kind of at the front end of it. And I joke that I disliked the system I was working with so much that I pulled myself away to go and make it better, because I never wanted my platform to make an ops guy felt like I felt, right? I never wanted my platform to make an analyst felt like I felt. So being in there, it gave me a strong idea for the voice of the customer, all right? A strong idea to know that I don't necessarily know exactly what I want as the product manager. I'm not going to know everything just from inside of my knowledge. Like, I'm going to have to talk to clients. I'm going to have to talk to customers. I'm going to have to talk to vendors. There's always going to be a surprise out there, right? QA is going to test every variation of every number possible, and the client is going to put in a different number, right? Like, there's going to be some sort of curveball that's going to come at you from the client. I think being in the ops, being in servicing, talking to the client, like, using the platform, it just gave me a much better understanding of what I wanted to do, and also what the clients were asking for. Because the analysts will always ask for one thing, the client's always going to ask for something else. The engineer that's building the software, if he doesn't really get that, and this is, I didn't touch on this, when you get in your PI planning, right? I want to figure out, you should know why you're building the product, right? Like, everyone should have a real understanding of what the financial I'll speak personally, right? Like, I want my QA, I want my engineers to know, like, what they're building. They're doing work sprint at a time, right? They're doing work in a user story and some digestible chunk of work that they can get through in 2 weeks. But do they know what they're building and why they're building it? And if they don't, right, I bet they would make different decisions inside of that sprint than if they do know. So we like to talk in our PI planning, like, what are you building? What are we focusing on this PI? How does it fit into the larger platform? And then how do we actually, how does that make our product successful? Because all those things have to tie together in order to have that successful product. So really getting that understanding, which is where I came from, and really knowing why I'm using this tool and why a client is calling into me. I've always brought that with me, because I've never wanted someone else to have that pain of working in what's been the most god awful design software that you've ever had, right? I've got 2 questions in here. So I have, what role does research or working with UX researchers play in the influencing the roadmap? So I don't want to say it influences the roadmap. I want to say that it influences the timeline of the roadmap, and it influences how we should be getting things done. So oftentimes you want UX coming first, right? You want that, in my mind, you want that user experience and those researchers getting done first, and they want to design what it should look like. Because if you just let the engineers and developers go, they're just going to build what they're comfortable with, right? And everyone's got their own parameters of what systems they have to use, and the approvals, and all your internal compliance, and how you have to go through it. But that work should come after you've got your designs. So when I talk about my roadmap, I talk about my 2-year plan and my 3-year plan, you want to bring in UX early, those guys should be doing work to kind of show you the shells of what things should look like. As the ops guy, where do I want to be going next? What feels comfortable to me when I'm clicking through X, Y, and Z? How do I know what I want to do next? What do I like my landing screen to look like? What are my widgets? Like all of that, you can't start developing and then shoehorn that in there and not expect to have tech debt, right? You get that UX out first. It goes back to what I just talked about, like really understanding what your users want. It's going to help you build smoother. So I think it will influence the timing of the roadmap, maybe not necessarily the roadmap itself, depending on who we have to talk to, the amount of people we have to talk to, right? The different types of people we have to talk to, all of that kind of plays into when do I want to get things done? How early do I need to bring in UX? I've got another question in here. It says, is t-shirt sizing okay, or should everything be points? I don't think everything should be points at all. Everyone's got their own, we use Fibonacci. I think that's fairly common around. I think when you are getting to your next, when you're talking about your PI and you're talking about your next 6 sprints worth of work, if you're 85% confident, 90% confident that you're going to deliver that, those should all be in points. When you've gotten a few quarters under your belt and I say have like confidence in that velocity and capacity for your team, you should be able to t-shirt size anything that's 6 months to a year out. I think the advantage of that is you're not tying yourself to anything. You should wholly be building in as much contingency as you're comfortable with when you're giving those t-shirt sizes. And it helps budget. I will say that there's probably a lot of, I don't know how other people feel, but there's a lot of I'll say budgeting doesn't really work well with Agile in practice. So if you can accurately t-shirt size out kind of how much things are going to cost at 100,000, 50, whatever the scale of your budget is, it's going to make it smoother down the path. Now you have to hit those numbers, right, and be comfortable with that. But if you've got 6 months, 9 months worth of data on, hey, we built feature A, it took us 100 points, it cost us $100,000. I know that a point's about $1,000, right? Feature B is roughly twice the size of that. It should be, I would say, $250,000. So I want to build myself in like a little buffer, right? Having those numbers, being comfortable for t-shirt sizes for things on your roadmap, it will make life easier. Delivering on those t-shirt sizing numbers, right? When the time comes, putting in your assumptions, making sure that everyone's on the same page with what you're talking about and managing those expectations. That's what kind of gets you I'll say, puts the confidence in you that you are the product manager that knows what you're talking about. You understand your team and you understand kind of how that works. So there's another one in here. I'll say, how do you make sure all of this is happening after a layoff with now half the team size? If you're going by pure Agile, you've got your Scrum team set and now you've got half the team set, your roadmap just gets pushed out, right? I don't think that the point of having a team and the point of delivering on that team is, and more so when you get into like t-shirt sizing, your points is predictability, right? So if I have a team and I've got my team size of X and I know I can do 100 points a sprint, I'm going to do 600 points for this quarter. If my team size is now half a sprint, I'm just going to knock it down to 300 points. Or my team size is now half of X, right? I'm just going to knock it down to half. It makes it hard to, speaking from like the business side of it, right? It makes it hard to accurately price deals. It makes it hard to accurately understand how much budget you're going to ask for. When you have people that say they're delivering 100 points in 40 hours worth of work, but they're probably delivering 100 points in 60 hours worth of work because everyone feels pressured to deliver. Like, I don't want that. I've never wanted that. I've never pushed my team to work more hours than we've all agreed upon. Because as you start to t-shirt size things out, maybe your team doubles, but now they don't have to work the 60 hours. Now they're not working 60 hours, they're working 40 hours. They're only delivering 2/3 of what they were. So now your t-shirt sizing is all askew because your team was, under promising and over delivering on their earlier numbers because they felt that squeeze. Now that they're cut in half, or maybe that they're doubled, like how can you predictably work that out? It's very hard. It's important to be honest with your team with the sizing so that if your team does go to half, you can accurately say, guys, I had 2 10-person teams. I've got 1 10-person team. This is what we're working on delivering. We talked last quarter. We've prioritized all these features. I did it 1 to 10. I'm now going to give you 1 to 5. Do you want to maybe look at 6 to 10? Does this change any of your prioritizations, right? It goes with managing that expectations, managing your output, and feeling comfortable that half the team is going to deliver. I mean, it could be less, right? Half the team could deliver 250 points instead of 300, depending on how that worked. But having the numbers, having the data, feeling confident that your team can do that work when they're cut in half, and then supporting them, I think that's most important to me, right? Confidence in your team, confidence in your leadership, and then backing up that if they say we lost half the team, we can only deliver half the work, going for that. How that's going to be taken, right? I can't help you with that. The business will most likely push back, or they'll ask for more. Seeing just what else you can do with that. Like, I'm happy to, anyone can add me on LinkedIn and we can talk through kind of, I've been through multiple rounds where teams have been cut in half or doubled instantaneously for work, and they're just, the saying is that 9 women can't make a baby in 1 month, right? Like, you just can't add on to your team that quickly and expect everything to get done immediately. It's just not how us work. That's not how that works. Bottom one I have, next question is, should a roadmap have dates? Anything outside of my PI, I just put in the quarters. I put in a box on a PowerPoint that I can easily move around, because those dates and those timelines easily move around. I don't put anything into a date because there's budget issues. There's, things like COVID happened, things like mergers and acquisitions, right? There's always going to be some sort of change. I don't have a date on anything goes outside of 6 sprints for a quarter. We do our quarterly planning. That's about as comfortable as I'm going to get from a budget perspective, from a velocity perspective, from a, if you need me to hire more people because you want to deliver more, then I'm going to need more time. So I only put things out for a quarter, and we talk through the next quarter. I have a 2-year plan. I've got a 3-year plan. Most of that's the slide with where I want to be, right? That's where I want our product to be. It's enough to gather interest, right? But it's not enough for anyone to hold me to any hard dates or hard dollars, because there's just too many variables that go outside of that.
Awesome.
Any more questions? I don't know if anyone has any. Feel free to type them in, like I said, or ping me on LinkedIn after. Like, I'm always happy to talk.
I think we may have broken the record for most questions, at least in the shortest period of time here. So I'd call it a success.
Thanks, Brian.
Cool. If no more questions, then I think we can wrap up.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. I had a good time. I hope you didn't mind me just droning on. Always happy to add me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to talk. Happy to talk EY, happy to talk consulting, financial crimes, product, whatever it is. I'm always here.
Thank you so much, Cory.
Thanks, team.
All right. Thanks, everyone.